Welcome to Your Family's Health, the program that focuses on healthcare issues with unique and different modalities for taking charge of your health today. Experts talk weekly with our continuing roster of guests from around the country and right here in Nassau County to keep you up to date on the latest health issues and trends. Take care of your mind, body, and soul. Spend the next half hour with the voice of Nassau Community College, 90.3 WHPC, and get on the journey to better health.
Hello and welcome to Your Family's Health. My name is Dr. Jeanine Cook-Garard from the nursing department here at Nassau Community College. Nearly 30% of first responders such as police, firefighters, and EMTs will develop PTSD as a result of trauma experienced in their workplace. Today, we will look more into PTSD and how it affects people in these stressful occupations. My guest today is Dr. Marilyn J. Wooley, a psychologist and traumatologist who specializes in working with first responders and treating post-traumatic stress injuries. She is the author of How Heroes Heal, Stories of First Responders and Their Journey from Post-Traumatic Stress Injury to Post-Traumatic Growth, which provides a pathway towards recovery and growth for these real-life action heroes. Dr. Wooley, welcome to Your Family's Health on the voice of Nassau Community College, 90.3 WHPC.
Thank you. I'm glad to be here.
So good to have you, and this is a very interesting topic. Tell us about what made you want to become a psychologist and a traumatologist? Define that for us.
Well, in my history, I have also always been interested in psychology, even as a child. I was reading psychology books as a child. And what happened in my family really propelled me into studying traumatology, which is the study of trauma and how it affects people and what can be done to help people who have suffered trauma and develop symptoms from it. So, what happened is my grandfather, I didn't know as a child. I knew there was something not quite right. He was very, very intelligent man. He had been a brigadier general in World War II. But he was always stressed and kind of, irritable and withdrawn. And later I found out, after my dad died, I found the trunk in the attic. And I discovered that my grandfather was one of the liberators of Dachau prison camp in World War II. And his experiences, I have his letters from all during the war. And his experiences, you can tell that he was really impacted by the experience of going into Dachau and seeing, he referred to the 50 boxcars of bodies that he couldn't get to in time. And he just suffered this intense guilt that he hadn't been able to do something about the situation, which of course there really was nothing he could do, but he still felt guilt and it affected him the rest of his life. So that kind of propelled me into being interested in it. And then I did my postdoctoral hours to be a psychologist at the Long Beach Veterans Administration Hospital. And there I was working with Vietnam veterans. And it just kind of all clicked. It all kind of came together. And I decided this is what I really want to do. This is a real interest. It's a personal interest and a professional interest. So that's how I got into the field.
That's fascinating. So tell me what the difference in trauma and stress.
Well, everybody experiences stress. I mean, stress is not a bad thing necessarily. I mean, we talk about eustress, which is good stress. And eustress, got you to work this morning. Eustress propels you to ask for a raise or to, go shopping even for daily activities. And so, when that stress becomes traumatic stress, the difference is that traumatic stress is you have witnessed something that is beyond what normal stress could ever be. I mean, some people say human beings should never see this. And, what first responders, what they see and experience, you might think that no human should ever have to be exposed to that. But of course, that's what they do. So traumatic stress is being in a situation where somebody is in danger or dies. It could be yourself, it could be somebody you love, or just another human. But the circumstances are so difficult, so traumatic, that it affects you in a different way than just regular stress. It affects different parts of your brain. And it really is, an injury of your brain.
Wow. So tell us about your book. What is How Heroes Heal all about? How do you come to dealing with your dad, and his trauma, and how did that land you into actually writing a book?
Well, I started I'm a psychologist, a licensed psychologist, and I started about 40 years ago. And over the course of that time, I was interviewing people, first responders, and, other people too, but this book focuses on first responders who had experienced traumatic stress. And I started collecting stories, and that's what this book is. It's a series of stories of individuals who experienced horrific types of events. And the purpose of the book was to show what they went through and how they healed. It's, how heroes heal is how they managed to come out of that. And some of them hit bottom. They were lost their careers, lost their families because they were so stressed. But this book is about how they recovered. And it's hopeful. That's what I wanted it to be. I wanted people to be able to read it and say, yes, I went through something terrible too, but I can heal from it.
Some of these stories that are in your book, do they include the COVID pandemic and how first responders dealt with that? I
was just finishing writing it when COVID hit.
Wow.
So no, I don't have any COVID stories in there, but that would be a good subject.
Yeah, I would think that they would be. So how do people develop it? It's after that catastrophic event, seeing it. Now, does it involve, I know it involves visualizing it. When you develop this trauma, is it also involving all of your senses, like the smell and, the memory of, how is it, how in depth is it?
It affects your whole body. It's kind of like, if you think about it, what happens in your brain when you experience these incidents, critical incidents, we call them, is it affects everything, all your senses. And there's a part of your brain, the amygdala, that is kind of our fight or flight part. And so it's a very basic part of your brain that is there to save your life. So it wants to give you the warning signs that something is wrong in that incident. And people who develop PTSD, we don't always know who's going to develop it, but most people have had some other traumatic event that the current event triggers. And of course, with first responders, there are many events. There are hundreds of events that they have, and it adds up definitely. But you develop these symptoms that affect you. You see it, you hear it, you smell it, and if you, in the extreme form, you have a true flashback, it's like you're still in the incident. Mm-hmm. It can be very terrifying for people.
So how is PTSD diagnosed?
Well, there's a series of symptoms, and, they include being exposed to an event or events with, first responders. There's more than one. There are other things that happen. So flashbacks, I mentioned, is one of them, very vivid flashbacks, and that can be terrifying. There's other intrusive recollections like nightmares. And, people with PTSD often wake up with nightmares, or even when they're just minding their own business, walking along, they'll all of a sudden this image will pop into their head. It's terrifying. It makes them feel crazy. They're not crazy, but it makes you feel that way. It's like your mind says there's nothing happening right now, but your body remembers that trauma, and it activates again as if you were still in it. So your body is reacting as though something horrible is happening, even if there is nothing happening. So what people do is they start to self-isolate. They can get depressed. To cope, they often abuse substances and other things. They avoid situations, people that remind them of the incident. They feel on edge. We call it hyperarousal. They feel anxious all the time, and often have memory loss, trouble concentrating, insomnia, of course, because they don't want to go to sleep because they'll have a nightmare. And also, it affects their personality in terms of they become very negative. They can become very self-critical. It was my fault that incident happened, or I'm a bad person because I couldn't fix it. And that's what I have with my grandfather. I think is that he felt like he couldn't do anything about it. It was so horrific that he dealt with that shame for the rest of his life, and it affected him in many ways.
You're listening to Your Family's Health on the voice of Nassau Community College, 90.3 WHPC. My name is Dr. Jeanine Cook-Garard, and today you're learning about PTSD and specifically how it affects our first responders. My guest today is Dr. Marilyn Wooley, a psychologist and a traumatologist who specializes in treating post-traumatic stress injuries. She is the author of How Heroes Heal, Stories of First Responders and the Journey from Post-Traumatic Stress Injury to Post-Traumatic Growth. Love that title. So this question is a little weird, but is it possible that an individual experiences PTSD and doesn't really even know it? They suppress it. All of their symptoms are suppressed until something happens.
That's not a weird question at all. I've been treating people individually and in groups for years. And very often, the first thing that we talk about, because they come in and they say, I'm feeling like I'm crazy.
Yeah.
And, I don't know what's going on. And they're not even connecting it to the event or events. And so when I started explaining to them, okay, this is what's happening to your brain. You're a normal person having a normal reaction to an abnormal event. Not that you want PTSD to be categorized as normal. Nobody wants that. It's a very difficult experience. But then, when I start explaining to them, you're not going crazy. This is what's happening to you. It's a relief. I mean, they might not know what to do about it at that point. That's what the rest of therapy is about. But even being validated that they're not going crazy, that they are, in fact, experiencing something that is, I guess what we call normal after that experience, that they're having symptoms that are normal, then they feel better.
So is PTSD curable?
Well, so, the fight or flight part of your brain is very primitive. I mean, it's like our dog brain. Doesn't have to do with thinking. You can't talk to it. You can't reason with it. It's a very basic part of your brain. And so, although you manage your symptoms and get through your symptoms, reduce your symptoms greatly with various techniques, you might not all be 100%. But the thing I say is you might not be who you were before, but you can be better. And that's the point of this book, is showing people that they can actually improve. The post-traumatic growth involves being more connected to yourself, to your family, having greater spiritual connection, all that. You can actually be better. If you start analyzing the issues that are going on with you, you can improve and be better. So you may not be who you were, but you might be better.
Yeah. So as a psychologist and someone comes to you for therapy, what type of therapy options are given for someone who has PTSD?
Well, there's many things that I use. Cognitive behavioral therapy is one of the things. And that, because that seems to have the big efficacy. There are a number of therapies. Personally, what I do is use what is called EMDR, which is a way of processing trauma. I do a lot of that. There's also brain spotting and some other tapping solutions that you use.
What are those?
There's emotional freedom therapy is one of them. There's a website called the Tapping Solution that talks about different ways of tapping on yourself or somebody else tapping on you. You can tap on yourself. And it seems to relieve that stress. It seems to, the EMDR and the brain spotting seem to reorient your brain so you're able to get out of the emotional part and more into the thinking part where you can actually think your way through it. So there's many techniques, and I use kind of, a combination of things. I kind of joke whatever's working. And but basically you're trying to get your brain so that it's working together, so that the emotional part and the thinking part are communicating better, and you're not just stuck in the emotional part. Mm-hmm. So there's a thing called amygdala hijacking, where your amygdala, it's your fight or flight part, your amygdala kind of takes over everything and the rest of your brain. And it can be very threatening because you're not acting the way you think you should. Mm-hmm. You're not able to control yourself the way you should, you think.
So does that couple with the therapies that you talked about with actually just communication? Does it include medications that you may prescribe for patients?
I don't prescribe, but yes, it can. I do have people who are on medication if they're really having a hard time. An antidepressant or an anxiolytic can sometimes help. One of the problems is people, especially first responders, tend to want to drink because then they can get to sleep, but their sleep is not good sleep. And, I have to tell them, you have to get off the alcohol. Yeah. Because if you have PTSD and you're drinking, you will not get better. It ruins your sleep. It ruins your brain's ability to process. You will not get through it. Mm. So drinking is just not helpful at all.
It's not a good coping mechanism at all.
Alcohol is not your friend.
Right.
So that's one thing I emphasize, that, do whatever we have to do to treat the alcohol use.
We're talking about first responders who have PTSD. Would you ever suggest that first responder to move to a different occupation altogether? And not to go back to being a firefighter since they have experienced so much trauma? Can they still function in that capacity?
Yes. Many people go back to work. They want to go back to work. They want to do their job. They would miss their job if they couldn't do it anymore. But sometimes it's just too much, and it's just time. They're done. And, I work with people who have decided to end their careers. I like to get them back to work because they love their work. They went into it because they loved it. But sometimes they, just can't function that way anymore. Yeah. And I've been in the difficult position of saying to them, I think you're done. Yeah. I don't think this is doing you any good anymore. And if you go back, you might start drinking again, or you might start having irritability. That's a big problem that spouses say. You might start having, the emotional outburst, all the other things that you get with PTSD. And so if they can go back to work, that's great. But sometimes they can't. Yeah.
So how can I support someone if this is a loved one of mine? How can I support them who have, sustained PTSD? How do I help?
Well, one thing I like to do is educate the spouses and the family members, if that's appropriate. But talk to them about the person, your loved one, is not doing this to be mean or terrible. They're suffering from PTSD. And once they understand the symptoms, they can do some things to help them, not confront them over their symptoms in a hostile way, but be understanding about it. Mm-hmm. And, somewhat tolerant. I mean, not putting up with things that you shouldn't, but tolerant in terms of, I know you're having a hard day. It's really important to get the spouse the first responder to communicate, because talking is one of the things that you can do to work it through, to try and make sense of it, to try and say, I'm just feeling really irritable today. I need a little time off. Mm-hmm. Or I need something else to do. I need to distract myself, or I need to relax. I mean, there's a lot of relaxation things that you use. You can use yoga. I have clients doing yoga. Do yoga with your spouse. And first responders are getting a lot more open to other therapies like that too, which is good.
So you would recommend for someone who has suffered from PTSD to bring in their family member or their spouse with them to therapy, or is it an individual approach?
I would see them all together and just so we're on that same page. Maybe not every time. Some people like to have their spouse in every time, but I would have them come in at least to explain what's going on, at least to make sure everybody knows what's happening here. Yeah. Yeah. And the other thing is we're calling it now, it's not the official diagnosis, but in the DSM-3, the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual, we still call it PTSD, and ICD-10, the diagnostic categories that we use. We're focusing more on post-traumatic stress injury. It's an injury. It's not something that was in you. It's something that happened outside of you and you injured your brain. Mm-hmm. So it's really, treating the injury is really the thing. And the first responders and their spouses can get behind that more. If it's an injury. It's not something that just is what you are. It's an injured brain.
So tell me about the personality type, because I know emotionally some people are more fragile than others. Is there a personality that would be more sensitive to a trauma versus someone else, maybe more of an introvert or extrovert? Who's really more prone to this injury?
Really what we found is it's not so much personality. But of course, the first responders, they have a certain personality. I mean, they're hard charging, want to go, activity oriented, they like to do. But it's not so much the personality. It's more if they've had, the best predictor is if they've had some kind of trauma in their past. Okay. And they might not even see it as trauma. It might have been some kind of family trauma that they interpret as normal.
So it could be a cumulative kind of effect.
Yes, it could be a cumulative type thing, definitely.
Okay. When we're talking about a trauma in this book that you wrote, which is fascinating, can your book be generalizable to the public, outside of first responders, to anyone who has sustained some type of trauma, post-traumatic trauma or injury?
I've had feedback from civilians who have read it and said it's been very helpful in terms of understanding that. And I tried to make it in relatively understandable terms. The way I tried to write it, I tried to describe the post-traumatic stress injuries as, what's happening in the brain, what's happening in the body, what happens in life, as understandable. So I've had the feedback that has been very helpful to civilians too.
So this post-traumatic stress injury, do we see physiologic changes that can occur in patients as well? Does this turn into something that can be a health illness because of the continuous stress or trauma that has been incurred?
Absolutely. You see a lot of anxiety symptoms. People think they're having heart attacks. You see, if you're under stress all the time like that, it interferes with your body's ability to function normally. You can, get ulcers, headaches. I mean, there's some another kind of not real seizures, but people can develop a seizure-like illness from post-traumatic stress injury. And it's not, the brain waves are normal, but it's a pseudo seizure. And so, yes, all kinds of things you could develop from that.
So you mentioned post-traumatic growth. Let's go there. In your title of your book, what do you mean by post-traumatic growth?
Well, as I said, people can come through this and with doing the work on themselves, with focusing on getting better and doing the things that are prescribed by the therapist, whether it's relaxation or, reframing your thoughts, they can actually get better than they were before, more insightful, more having more compassion. Mm-hmm. That's one thing I see a lot is that the people tend to have a lot more compassion and they are closer to their families, once they go through this, once they start to get better. And spiritual growth is really important too. I think it's one thing that, what I say is PTSD takes away your soul. It takes away your ability to really enjoy life, to, be one with nature. I mean, just all of those things. So you can improve actually and get better. And so the way I chose the people that I interviewed was that they had all gone through some sort of growth so that actually they were better in the end. So like they chose to do things that were more meaningful and gave them a sense of purpose. One thing that's always that I emphasize is, you had a purpose as a first responder. Now, what are you going to do to have a purpose in the future? What is your purpose going to be? Mm-hmm. How are you going to be better for your family, better for your community, more in tune with yourself? What is your purpose going to be? Because I feel that that's a real essential part of recovering.
So tell us about your book, where to find it, and if you have a website, or how do we get in contact with this really significant information?
Well, you can get a free chapter on my website.
Okay.
And it's Marilyn J. Wooley, Ptsd.com/book. And if you go there, you can click on a link that will give you, if you put your name and email in there, it will give you a free chapter.
Oh,
so
great.
You can do that. You can also order the book on Amazon. So, and it's also a Kindle.
That's
and
awesome.
I'm getting, as we speak, I'm getting an audiobook prepared.
Oh, nice. So thank you for being here, Dr. Marilyn Wooley, a psychologist and traumatologist who specializes in treating post-traumatic stress injuries, and the author of How Heroes Heal, Stories of First Responders and the Journey from Post-Traumatic Stress Injury to Post-Traumatic Growth. We appreciate all of this information, and we hope that you stay healthy and continue to do the great work for all of the amazing first responders who certainly are heroes in this world. Thank you for being here.
Thank you very much.
This is Dr. Jeanine Cook-Garard from the nursing department here at Nassau Community College, and we want to thank you for listening to this week's edition of Your Family's Health.
We'd like to get your feedback on your family's health. Send your comments by emailing them to whpc@ncc.edu. Podcasts of today's show are available on iTunes, Android Podcasts, and Spreaker. This program was produced at the studios of Nassau Community College in cooperation with the nursing department. Join us next week for another edition of Your Family's Health on the voice of Nassau Community College, 90.3 WHPC.